We're going to kick off this next block with an incredible speaker, and a lot of you may know who she is. We're very fortunate to have Tanya Hosch with us this morning. For those that don't know, Tanya is the Executive General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy with the AFL. Her resume is so extraordinarily broad. I couldn't possibly go through all of the accomplishments in this morning. But in 2021, she was South Australia's Australian of the Year. And as I said, she's had this long and very distinguished history in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy, in advocacy, in governance. And as you'll see very, very shortly, she is an accomplished public speaker with an incredible story to tell. So please welcome to the stage, Tanya Hosch.
Good morning, how are you? Sorry, I was a bit slow getting up. I was just smashing that second coffee. Thank you, Regan, for making sure I had one. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I once actually lived just around the corner from here in my late 20s when I was working at the Human Rights Commission, and I could basically roll out of bed and walk to work and get there within 15, 20 minutes. It was awesome. But I do love this country. In Sydney, most of my best friends actually live here. I don't usually need to be asked twice to come to Sydney. I live on Kaurna country in Adelaide and spent a lot of time on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, where the AFL headquarters are. But fortunately, it's a national game, so I do get to travel all around the country. I want to acknowledge the ongoing stewardship of country in this place and recognise Sydney as the place of first contact and the extraordinary loss that has happened. This is not country that will ever be properly returned to First Peoples. It's way too occupied, but I do want to acknowledge the ongoing connection and spiritual, cultural connection to land and waters and how important that still is to traditional owners today. I'd also like to acknowledge other Indigenous women who may be in the room and men if there are any as well, and tell you that I'm in solidarity with you, and it's so important that we stick together as much as we can. So I've been asked to come and talk about women's health and the way that we engage in health as a concept in the game of Aussie Rules football. Are there any Aussie Rules football supporters in the room? Yay! Woo! That is so great. I hope that you're going to be joining me on Saturday night going for the Sydney Swans. Anyone? Yes. But if you go for GWS, that is also good. It's pretty amazing. We've got 2 Sydney teams in the AFL finals this season. It's pretty exciting. I'm probably the only person at AFL House that's excited about 2 Sydney teams being in the finals. But that's because I grew up in Adelaide, and if you grow up in Adelaide, then you live for an AFL Grand Final without a Victorian team in it. So it's not really something that should be said by me, but there you go. It's really, I'm going to talk about the concept of health and First Peoples in sport, but in our code in particular, and talk about some of the things that we are increasingly recognising are important. Because I think in some ways, when you talk about health and we start talking about the importance of holistic health, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always looked at health in that way. And so bringing those systems into play in a professional sporting field takes time, but it's actually the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always dealt with health and wellbeing. But I've also got a personal story to tell, so I'll weave some of that into it too, just because I've got this really unusual story, I think. It's probably not uncommon, but all of a sudden I've found myself speaking at Senate inquiries about diabetes and foot health and all sorts of things just based on lived experience. To put that into context, for those of you who don't know, in August last year I had a lower right leg amputation after a foot reconstruction, trying to save my foot and my leg, and had basically not walked for about 3 years before that. So I'd done everything that I could possibly do to avoid the amputation, but then ended up having one. And that was a huge wake-up call, especially for me as someone who'd worked on constitutional recognition for 12 years, and it all just coincided with the date of the referendum, essentially. So, it was wild. I do not care to revisit 2023. But getting back to the importance of First Nations perspectives in health. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had an extraordinary experience where our lives have been impacted incredibly brutally from first contact, and obviously that had massive implications for people's health and wellbeing, both physical health and mental health. Losing control of traditional lifestyles which had sustained us as peoples for tens of thousands of years. We're actually the oldest living continuing cultures on the planet and had done that very well. Now, when you talk about culture, it's really easy sometimes, I think, to position it as something that is quite static and immovable. But culture evolves just like the landscape evolves. And Indigenous peoples, First peoples anywhere in the world would not have survived if they were not able to adapt to the environment that was their lifeblood, is where they get their food, their water, their sustenance, their shelter. Everything comes from that. And so do the stories, the spirituality, the dance, the language. It's all very interconnected. And so if you think about health needs for us, they're often very complex right from the get-go because the history of this country. And so even though I live a comfortable middle-class lifestyle now, statistically, I'm still much more likely to die before my non-Indigenous female peers. Particularly now that I've had an amputation, that's likely to take another 10 years off my life, unless I get my shit together. So let's hope that happens. I'm trying every day. But the health issues are much more complex. And so when you take into account the eradication of culture and denial of culture, language, forced removal of children, all the sorts of things that have occurred in this country, of course people's mental wellbeing has been massively impacted, and it passes through generations. So I'm actually seeing a psychologist at the moment, which I do from time to time, and mostly at the moment I'm seeing a psych because I really don't want to load up my baggage on my beautiful 16-year-old daughter, who is dealing with some things at the moment that are just bringing out the fiercest mother bear in me. And I really want to be very animated in response to those things, but really trying to work out how to support her in the right way without her wearing all my baggage of racism at school that she's now tackling. So that's just one example, and I'm sure that everyone would have their own, but in the Indigenous context, that is a given. That is just going to happen. And so it's so important that our systems in sport really do recognise that for Indigenous players who have a different cultural background and not part of the mainstream dominant culture, have some recognition that their identity, their expression of their identity, their spirituality, their beliefs, their cultural ways of being and knowing are supported, respected and recognised in the day-to-day life of being a professional athlete. Because if they're not going to perform at their best. Now, for those of you that haven't watched much Aussie Rules footy, just fill you in, blackfellas are really good at it. And I've got to tell you, it makes me feel very smug. I really love that about our game. And in fact, it's the reason I fell in love with Aussie Rules, because Aussie Rules is a big thing in Adelaide where I grew up. And we definitely, for me growing up, going through extraordinary degrees of racism, which was very normal in the 70s and 80s, and I know I look so much younger, but that's when I was at school. The seeing Indigenous people play footy was the only time I saw Indigenous people cheered for. It was the only time I saw people wanting to support us. And that was my place of connection then. It was just like, that's when I felt a sense of pride. That's when I felt like there was something of permission to be Indigenous. As soon as the game was finished, it was almost like that hadn't happened. But that's where my love for Aussie Rules came from. Something I shared with my Aboriginal dad. I'm a Torres Strait Islander woman. I was adopted. That's a whole other keynote. But that was something that I really enjoyed with my dad, and we shared that real love. And to see Indigenous superstars on the field and that black excellence out on the Aussie Rules footy field is something that really does create enormous pride in communities. I've been to some really remote parts of Australia, and I can't tell you how many kids I've met that are named after Aussie Rules football players. And it's true, like they'll have their whole name. There's a lot of Andrew McLeods in the APY lands, I can tell you, and he was an absolute gun player. So as a sporting code, we've got a responsibility, but it also makes no sense for us not to fully embrace a holistic way of engaging in social and emotional wellbeing of the whole person that really enables that sort of cultural engagement, cultural healing practices, and all of those sorts of things that are going to really ensure that every Indigenous player that takes the field, male and female, can be out there at their best. That's what we all want. There's a lot of pressure that comes with playing elite sport. I'm feeling completely stressed about Saturday night's game between Sydney and GWS. I'm not even out there. I'm completely stressed about it, and I'm AFL neutral. Even last Friday night, I was at North Sydney Oval watching AFLW Sydney playing Collingwood, and I felt exactly the same. And it's not even an anti-Collingwood thing, which is a very popular vibe. It was just like I'm just so excited for the Sydney team. He hasn't been in the competition too long to do well, and they won, and it was amazing, and there's fireworks, and who doesn't love that? But I'm very invested, but I'm invested in the people. So one of the things that the AFL's really invested in the last 12 months or so is working on a social, emotional and cultural wellbeing model that was developed by Indigenous health experts, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers over many years, which is a properly recognised health framework to assist the medical system to more fully and more effectively meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the health system. So we now have worked with the original authors of that framework, and they've assisted us to develop that same framework for our context. And so we now have an entire framework that is dedicated to that for our Indigenous athletes. Now, what's amazing, but actually not at all surprising, is how many elements of that are very attractive to non-Indigenous people. Very attractive to non-Indigenous people. One of the challenges, I think, of having to go into a health system that is highly regulated, and of course it needs to be, but with that regulation comes a fair bit of inflexibility as well, which I think is one of the big tensions in the system, to actually be in a position where you can be dealt with as a whole person, not just whether or not, you need medication, but have people to acknowledge that your context and your values may be quite different to the people that normally come through the door of a health centre, makes an enormous difference, and I can share some of my own story about that in a moment. One of the other things about this framework is it really requires us to think very carefully about what the preferences of the individual are, understanding that they come with a whole family and a community, and they are often juggling the obligations that come with that, but also the needs that come with that. And so if there's someone in their family that they have a cultural responsibility to who is unwell, that player is also going to be very much impacted by that set of circumstances, and it will impact whether their head is in the game, whether they're able to reconnect with family, whether we can get family down to them, whether they can go back and see family when they need to, because the circumstances are very different. And quite often, a lot of our players come from quite remote parts of Australia, so when they're on a break at the end of the year, they might be living in a community that is, during the day, 45 degrees. So, yeah, they're not going for a run, They're just not. So, would you? Probably there are some of you that would. You look like you do. But I wouldn't. I wouldn't, and I think the majority of us would not. So one of the other things I thought I would touch on, and I don't think I've got too much time left, is I went through a lot last year with my amputation. I'm type 2 diabetic. I live with depression, and I had gestational diabetes when I had my daughter. I had a really interesting doctor who said, look, because you're overweight and you're brown and you're older, when you had your child, you're probably going to get type 2 diabetes quite soon, even after the gestational diabetes has been removed, so get yourself tested. He didn't say that, he said, because you're old, fat and black, is what he actually said to me. What a cracker. Anyway, but I did take his advice, and by the time my daughter was 2, I found out I was type 2 diabetic. I didn't understand really what that meant. I didn't get the education I needed. Anyway, many years later, I ended up with a very rare disease called Charcot foot. Has anyone heard of it? Yeah, it's amazing how many people haven't, actually. I certainly hadn't. Had a foot reconstruction, had really brilliant care throughout. I have to say, really, really good care, courtesy of the main surgeon I was working with and her commitment to me, and also her sensitivity of me as an Indigenous woman. But there were 2 really big things that happened last year. I was dealing with that, but I'd also been involved in the campaign to change the Australian Constitution to recognise the people who've always been here. To put it into context, the Australian Constitution recognises coinage, it recognises lighthouses, it recognises Queen Victoria. and it doesn't say a single word about the people who've always been here. I really believe that that needed to change, and we had a chance to do that as a nation last year, and we missed that chance. I was speaking at a conference about women's bodies at the Opera House at the beginning of the year, and I got a question from the audience about how I felt about the referendum. And I didn't know what my answer to that was at that time. It was still very raw, but what the words that came out of my mouth were this. I had my leg amputated last year, and we also lost the referendum, and I don't know which I'm grieving more. So when we think about health, we think about wellbeing, we think about all of the activities and programs that are involved, all the advocacy that women in particular have put into ensuring that women's health needs are met appropriately. I do think that we're missing something if we don't also address the social and emotional wellbeing health of the nation. Thanks.
Tanya Hosch, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you for being so open there at the end. And I know you said you don't want to revisit 2023, and we won't harp on about it, but your advocacy is just so appreciated. And thank you for being who you are and for the strength that you showed last year. We really appreciate it. We're very grateful for you being here as well.